I would love to kind of just be involved in setting up one of these international museums based on personalities and their contribution. You have those international flags flying outside an international museum, you will draw tourists.
Welcome to this episode of the Cork Creative Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Michelle O'Mahony, a history consultant based right here in West Cork. Michelle will be sharing insights into her varied work, from delving into historical research, especially into the Irish famine and its far-reaching consequences, to organising historical and heritage events. She'll also discuss her involvement in remembering the Earl Grey scheme which sent young famine orphans to Australia, and her upcoming plans for an event and monument in Dunmanway. Michelle will emphasise why it's so important to make history accessible and engaging for everyone, and she'll touch on how her background in both history and event management have shaped her career. We'll also hear about the challenges and rewards of historical research and the exciting possibilities for growing history and heritage tourism in West Cork. So you're very welcome to Cork Creative, Michelle. Thanks for taking time out of your very hectic schedule to join us for this podcast.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Delighted to be with you and Cork Creative, and hello to the audience.
So I mentioned at the start of the podcast that you're very busy at the moment. Give us a breakdown of what the last 2 weeks have looked like for you and what you're planning for the next couple of months.
Oh, well, the last 2 weeks, Patrick, have been incredibly busy. I've been doing a lot of audio-visual work, a lot of podcasts. I've worked with the Sacred Heart Secondary School and their podcast there a few weeks ago, and it was lovely to get back in the classroom again, having a previous life a little bit as a teacher of English and history. It was lovely to speak with the children about what history means to them, and also to let them know what I do. A history consultant wasn't something they readily knew or had heard about, so it was great to go down different avenues and explore different ideas and concepts with them. I also had to do a webinar with the American Irish History Society on Fifth Avenue in New York recently, where I discussed the innocents and the children of the workhouse system during the Great Famine, with a case study on Cork City. And that was one particular chapter of my book, Famine in Cork City, that I published a number of years ago, and recently a second edition in 2023. I'm currently preparing for another webinar for my kinfolk, I suppose, with the O'Mahony Society in early May. And also then that led to radio interviews with Ireland Radio Canada. And I have a few more items like that lined up in coming weeks. And I suppose the big event for Dunmanway and for myself would be a sort of homecoming for some of the descendants of the Irish famine orphan girls who left Dunmanway during the famine years as part of the Earl Grey assisted immigration scheme in 1849 to 1850, and welcoming their descendants back to Dunmanway, showing them their home place. And we're going to have a wonderful day. And there's been a lot of research around this topic in recent years down in Australia, but very little in Ireland. So I've been delving into that, and I'm taking a major deep dive into looking at those 14 girls from Dunmanway who emigrated, and I suppose looking at their contribution to Australian society and how they helped to address the gender imbalance down in Australia at the time. And we're going to have an unusual heritage monument commemorating that event, plus interpretive signage, all within the confines of the workhouse rooms in Dunmanway. So a lot going on for the last few weeks, and a lot more to come in the coming 4 to 6 weeks.
And certainly a lot of strands and threads for us to pull on over the course of this podcast interview, for sure.
Oh, there's many different avenues. I suppose as a history consultant, people ask me, what do I do? And that can go down many different avenues. It's many different services for many different people, for organisations, for professionals, everything from solicitors to estate agents, down to a descendant just returning to West Cork and trying to figure out where they came from, and to almost assert their own sense of identity and where that community was based from, where their ancestors came from. So lots of different angles in my work, and no 2 days are the same.
Sure. And I suppose let's start at the beginning and where it all began, and your undergraduate career in University College Cork, and how that has informed all that you do now.
Well, I suppose a lot of my basis came from my undergraduate degree, where I studied under Professor Joe Lee, and I suppose the first thesis he asked us to produce was pick a topic, and I picked the Irish famine. And at the time, Joe was, I suppose, his book was in the fore.
Seminal would be the word, yeah.
We say it, yeah. So Joe's seminal tome of work was in the fore at the time, and he also was in the Senate. So for those couple of years, I worked closely with him as an undergraduate, and then I qualified after my thesis on the Workhouse. I went off, I did the higher dip in education, but I wasn't content to let that settle. I wanted to go back and explore more about the famine period and workhouses in particular. A lot of people like to write about the politicisation of the famine, whereas I like to look at the actual experience of the famine victims. So it was great to actually go and take another deep dive into life of an inmate in a workhouse. And that's been, I suppose, one of my central areas that I focus on in terms of research of the Great Irish Famine. What happened within the confines of these institutions, how they were run, almost akin to a penal settlement and a penal colony, and If the Walls Could Talk would be one of the, I suppose, stock lectures that I give to various groups and various historical societies. Life within the walls or behind the walls, more or less, is one of the main things that I would give talks about. And then working under Professor Lee and his other colleagues in the history department, I, as an undergraduate, was highly involved in organisation of conferences where I would meet a lot of high-profile dignitaries, politicians, people in the news. So I was given that opportunity to sit down with these people, almost to interview them, have dinner with them. And then the flip side was you were exposed to all elements of conference organisation, almost event management, and you liaised closely with the individuals within the history department and UCC as to how these events took place and how they unfolded. So that then gave me, I suppose, a good footing in event management and to do with heritage events in particular. So that's another niche that I explore with my consultancy. Everything from if you have a book launch, everything if you need a little bit of mentoring, a little bit of coaching if you're writing a book, right down to having a history and a heritage event. And it doesn't necessarily have to be history or heritage. It can be just any event in West Cork that you feel you would need assistance on, be it with communications, with research, even just to gather some speakers. I would have a wide network of colleagues and friends right around Ireland and internationally to get different speakers on different topics of history and heritage, if that's what somebody wanted. So that's another area to my portfolio as well.
You could argue, I suppose, that the undergraduate career in UCC and what you made of your undergraduate career of UCC was almost like an opportunity engine, and it provided you with the opportunity to develop skills that informed all the niches that you're working in now.
Oh, completely. I suppose I also was head tutor for the history department, so that gave me timetabling experience. It gave me logistics. It also allowed me to use my teaching qualification that I had got a couple of years earlier. I was tutoring a lot, but I was also correcting exam scripts. I was working closely, as I say, with Professor Lee, and at the time he was in the Senate, so it also got me over the fear of large crowds. For those of you that went to UCC, Pool 4 is not the smallest of theatres to deliver lectures in. So in his absence, or if he was away, I would get the notes and I'd be told to deliver my talk. And you had nothing better to do some mornings than face 400 or 500 students and get over the nerves pretty quickly. So that stood me in good stead since. So public speaking is not something that I necessarily relish, but it's not something that I'm afraid of. You know, it's one of those things you either love it or hate it. I don't mind it, is the simple answer to it.
You've highly evolved coping mechanisms.
Yes. So, you know, if you're thrown in at the deep end once or twice, you do learn how to cope, you know. So yeah, so that early years in UCC, and I suppose in total I spent 8 years there with the history department. So that really kind of gave me the good foundations to build upon going forward. And then in the last number of years, then I've set up that consultancy business because I knew history is where I wanted to work at. And there's not many consultants in Ireland that do what I do. So I'm kind of unique in that. There is a few and they tend to stick with more literature and writing books, whereas I'm offering services to various professionals where you wouldn't necessarily think that history and heritage would overlap in their careers.
So I suppose the historical skills, the research skills, and also the transversal skills in terms of event management and logistics that you picked up in UCC of what you brought to OM History Consultant and what informs the diversity of the offering that you have there with your company now as well.
Yes, so the skills there would be critical thinking, the ability to assess information, the ability to bring the salient points across that your audience wants to know, and also to make it accessible for the general public and people who would be not the professional historian, who wouldn't know the full background to a story, but need to know the key events to make it more understandable and relatable even in a modern day context. So I do a lot of heritage signage for people and for history groups, including one that will be unveiled in Dunmanway in May the 24th as part of the Famine Orphan scheme. And those signs, they take a little bit of time to put them together because you have to do the research, but then you have to figure out what exactly is the key point and what sort of images you would like to portray on the signage, because it is interpretive. It's how somebody interprets it, and it's to bring the key points across to people. And those skills are not just involved in heritage, they're involved in any research that I would undertake for any client, even if it's sometimes I get requests from engineers, I get requests from architects. There might be a ruin on a premises that somebody's trying to go for planning with. They need to understand the background, the context. Was it used as an agricultural outbuilding? Was it a farm shed? Was it a dwelling house? Who lived there if it was a dwelling house? Can we prove people lived there? How far back can we go? All of these questions come into play for various professionals in various walks of life. And that's where I get called in then to offer my services to people. So it's largely a set of bespoke services to cater for individual needs where people might necessarily think a historian might be the answer to that query. But more and more, I've talked to a number of people in the auctioneering business, to engineers, architects, and those services there is a market for them.
True.
And no 2 days are the same, because you could be doing everything from simple research to a sign to putting on the wellies, going out into the middle of a field and looking at some ruins, which is great. You have all sides. You have the good day in the office and you have the on-site field trip as well.
True. No, indeed. So armed with that diversity of skill set, with OM History Consultant, if we want to pull on the thread of event management, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
So building on the experience you had of running conferences in UCC, what's your experience of running conferences in West Cork? How is West Cork set up for large events? And do you manage events in West Cork or more widely in Ireland?
Okay, so I suppose my time, as I said, in UCC, I would have been involved in the background, more or less, but watching everything, meeting people, understanding what was going on, watching the dynamics, watching the organisation, and understanding that you really do need to be very, very precise and have a very tight ship and making sure that events run according to plan. And one of my things that I often say to my clients is that as long as the general public don't see a mistake, I don't mind if I've seen the mistake and I've hidden it and nobody knows it other than me, that's perfectly fine.
It's the duck swimming, the manic activity under the water, and everything is serene at the top.
Once it looks perfect, it doesn't have to be perfect, but once it looks perfect. So I've come with that background to event management, and I suppose over the years now, really since 2012, 2013, I've done 2 large McCarthy gatherings in Dunmanway, where we had a few hundred people attend both. I've been involved, let's say 2 or 3 years ago, with an O'Donovan clan gathering. So I would take over the running order of the day when the event takes place. People would need me to do MC. I'll be in the background making sure everything is planned down to a T. I will also ensure publicity and the comms, that all of that and the media are there. I like where it's a kind of a medium event. I think there's a market for that in West Cork, especially where you're talking clan gatherings, history events, heritage events. They don't tend to be a huge following.
Mm-hmm.
But then I've branched off, so we'd have the clans. You had the O'Donovan clan. I'm involved with the O'Mahony clan as well. Of course, I have to be. I wasn't going to get away with that. I do, however, see that as more of a hobby, the O'Mahony clan, that I like to be just in the audience for that and not take too much control, but I do tend to help them out. And then the McCarthys, I tend to get associated by default with the McCarthys over a number of years. People ring me up if it's anything to do with a McCarthy person in West Cork or County Cork or South Kerry. people go, okay, you've done these gatherings, what do you know? So I would know a number of professional historians who can assist with those queries for them. Also, then moving from that, then I've kind of moved into assisting Irish veterans down in Kinsale when they had their premises there. So that would be where you would recognise Irish people who might have been in the Army in the UK, they might have been in the Navy in Australia, they might have been in the Marines in America, and where they would have made a contribution as an Irish veteran in any conflict globally. So by accident and default, I kind of worked with those groups purely because their descendants were coming back and they were looking for research as to where, you know, somebody who may have been a fighter pilot in the Second World War, where did his family come from in West Cork? So in turn, then I've worked with the Irish veterans. I also do a little bit of work from time to time with the OAD up in Collins Barracks, where I link in with them, and if they're passing through West Cork or whatever, I might give them a little tour. I'm due to go up and give them a talk on my book on the famine. So that's another group that I work with. And then obviously recently, last year, I was involved in handling all the media and communications then for the Star Wars themed event, Feel the Force in Dunmanway, which was hugely successful. And this year then I'm working on the event regarding the famine orphans. So there's a lot going on.
Do you think that, I suppose, there's scope for more events in West Cork, history events in West Cork? Do you think there's enough of an appreciation of the rich heritage here, as much as we talk about history in Ireland, but is the history of West Cork properly represented?
The history of West Cork, I think, Patrick, is a little bit, I won't say undervalued, but I think perhaps underappreciated.
Okay.
And I think we need to dig a little bit more below the surface. I know in relation to Dunmanway, where I'm from, I've been doing a lot of digging in numerous characters, individuals, people that have made a huge contribution globally.
Sure.
But whose origins back here in West Cork have largely, I suppose, been under the radar, and nobody actually knew who they were or that they came from here. I know we've discussed, you know, on previous conversations, different people, you know, everybody from somebody in the JFK administration to one of America's famous artists to incredible fighter pilots in the RAF, various people that their contribution has gone unnoticed to a certain extent.
With the extent that they've gone unnoticed with veterans, and you mentioned the veteran activity you do, is that because I suppose Ireland has a tenuous relationship with the fact that we're contributing to the armed forces in other countries because of our reputation for neutrality and that being tied in with nationalism, or is there a deeper underlying reason, do you think?
I think some of it, I think, goes back to our own revolutionary period,
sure.
Where I think a lot of people would be afraid to say that they had family members involved in conflict abroad, be that in America or be that in the UK, for example, the RAF, the Navy.
Sure.
But I think you can't really get away from it, because I know other families in Ireland would have had people involved in the British Navy in the late 1800s and the turn of into the 1900s, before any of this sort of revolutionary period started, and people involved in the merchant navy, and it purely was a way of life for them because they liked the sea or they liked the army, and they came from a family tradition of that. And
Roger Casement would be a great example.
So I think it's been kind of, some people have brushed it under the carpet, but I think now it's the time to actually see their contributions for what their contributions were.
Sure, for sure.
And I think people don't need to be afraid so much anymore of what those contributions were. But even if you talk about Hovenden the artist, I know Thomas Hovenden was a famine orphan, and I suppose I kind of like researching him. He came from Dunmanway, he was orphaned, and he became one of the foremost painters of what's called American Heart and Homeland, where there's these sceneries in the 1870s and 1880s in America of sons leaving home. Also, he was one of the first painters in America to actually paint the freed slaves in a domestic setting in their own domestic scenes. And for that, he's noted as being extremely famous. But if you look around in Dunmanway, he's not honoured here, you know, and people don't know it. So I suppose when you dig into all these famous people that come from West Cork, to get back to the first question, their lives tend to be, I suppose, honoured elsewhere, but not necessarily here. We tend to have one or two characters in each town, but there's an awful lot more to explore. And I was on an interview with a radio station there about 2 years ago. And I was saying what I really think would be lovely was if we had like almost an international museum in West Cork, where the contributions of all these people on an international scale were highlighted, be they in art, be they in the military, be they in the Navy, be they in society, just that their home area recognises them. Now, in the case of some of these people, we might be 1 or 2 generations removed. It might have been that their grandfather left during the famine or post-famine period, but they still have that link. And I suppose one of the phrases I've said on radio, if I'm promoting West Cork, is sometimes I do wonder if West Cork is that cradle of civilization to a certain extent. Because, when you go digging for something, you inevitably do find, if you're talking these big areas of global history, whether it's the JFK administration, if you're looking at that particular era in time, if you're looking at the astronauts and you're looking at science, we have Ellen Hutchins below in Skibbereen. We also would have Michael Collins, the astronaut, his grandfather, great-grandfather from Dunmanway. Eileen Collins, who's I think is not a relative to Michael Collins, was the first female to pilot the shuttle for NASA. And she, again, is a descendant from Dunmanway. So, if you're talking the whole spectrum of people into science and whatever sector you're looking for, most towns would have somebody that will, slot into that position and that role. And West Cork just seems to have it in abundance. Maybe it's because of the diaspora. Maybe it's because of our rebellious nature down here. But for some reason or other, we do tend to have it. And, I think even students of the Leaving Cert going forward, think a little bit outside the box if you're looking for a case study. If you're interested in gender history, if you're interested in female history, if you're in whatever is your area, try and find a personality that fills that void for you and turn that personality then into your research study topic for the Leaving Cert. That way you'll engage more with it. And little things like that are good for people in West Cork to know and good for students of history to know as well.
So I suppose it's the socioeconomic conditions that bred the diaspora, particularly to the extent that it was in West Cork, given the poverty and with the impact of the famine, kind of led to such rich raw materials for you to mine and use your historical skills for.
Like, I suppose I'm primarily a 19th century historian. So the Irish diaspora and the conditions that led up to that and where that diaspora ended up. Some people automatically think, the diaspora just went to America. They forget there's New Zealand, there's the convicts, there's the orphans, there's Australia,
Argentina.
And there's Argentina, there's South America, there's Europe. You can even go back further. We have the wild geese going to France. I know when we did the McCarthy gathering, people were laughing at me. I said I was going to get McCarthy wine from France and people just thought I was mad. But we did get it because there is a McCarthy winery. Just like you see Lynch wineries, there's different names and there's different wineries down there. So that diaspora has been going on. It's nothing new. It didn't just start with the famine and that time period in 19th century Ireland. The diaspora has been there for years and years and century and millennia probably. But it's just to tap into it. Sure. And I think now more than ever, perhaps in the current environment and, in socioeconomic times like we're in at the moment, people tend to forget maybe a little bit of their history and heritage, and maybe, that we need to kind of revisit that again. I know in 2013, there was a lot of talk about gatherings and welcoming people back, and people were getting certificates of their Irish heritage. I think now people are the idea of Irish passports is in the back of people's mind. But, we should also remember that what are we really good at in Ireland? And what do we have to offer, which is history, heritage, hospitality and culture. And there's a lot of resources there that can be tapped into. And there is potential for a lot more niche festivals. They don't have to be the big bells and music festivals. Bantry has the great literary festival. It has its great chamber music festival. We have the West Cork History Festival. But there's other, areas where we can focus on, personalities from West Cork that were involved in scientific advances. We can broaden that where we can cater for other people with specific key interests.
It's an important shout out.
Loads to explore. I could talk all day.
It's an important shout out to local politicians and those with looking to fund a cultural exercise that there could be the need for that international museum. As you said.
There is a need for it.
Yeah, for sure.
Like I often say to people, if and it would be my dream. So if there's any millionaires out there who have millions of euro, I would love to kind of just be involved in setting up one of these international museums based on personalities and their contribution. Because if you have people down in Australia, people in America, you have those flags flying, international flags flying outside an international museum, you will draw tourists. And it's something that it needs to be done. Now, I know we have EPIC as the Immigration Museum in Dublin, but I think we need something down here in the countryside.
Sure.
You know, that museums should not be the preserve of the large, we'll say, cosmopolitan cities. You know, if there's an unusual museum tucked away down in West Cork, in a small town like Dunmanway, you know, that draws footfall into this area, and undoubtedly that's going to spread out into the other surrounding towns. Dunmanway is centrally located. You're half an hour from Skibbereen, Clonakilty, wherever you want to go.
And some of the best exhibits are in smaller settings.
They're in smaller settings.
The Roger Casement exhibit in Tralee was amazing. The recent Sit Stand Smoke VR experience that they did in West Cork, and they showcased smaller events, that was amazing. But it doesn't need, as you say, the giant venue for these.
You don't need a huge venue. You just need good investment and some good ideas and some key personalities. Can you imagine, just for argument's sake, if there was something to do with NASA in Dunmanway? Can you imagine the children, the interest in science and STEM learning? All of those concepts would automatically follow from it. If children realise that some of the famous astronauts that they learn about in their history books actually came from West Cork in terms of their grandparents and that diaspora, and how it's all linked.
An international and interstellar museum.
An interstellar museum, Patrick. But even something as simple, you know, like children then would be more interested maybe in playing with Lego that had a space shuttle. You know, sure. You have all these spin-offs that will come.
Yeah.
You know, there's an element in, if you can build it, people will come, people will travel. And West Cork is there to be explored.
Sure.
You know, and there's a lot more to West Cork than just your scenery, your walking trails, and your geology. There's an awful lot there.
That's a powerful hypothesis and delivery, no, in fairness. Good. I agree. As well, I would. I'm from here too.
You are.
So parking that thread with event management and that whole scope, then we move to the research angle, and I suppose it's part and parcel in that you're dealing with your events are very historically minded, the ones that you've mainly managed, with the exception of guided tours with Wookiees last June bank holiday. But the research, I suppose, first question is, how difficult is it to do the kind of research that you do, given the fact that a lot of Irish historical record met with a rather explosive end during the revolutionary period? And how easy is it to access international sources to buttress the kind of research that you do then?
Well, I suppose it's twofold. It can be quite easy in the digital era because a lot of countries have pretty good archives. For example, at the moment I'm working with the Famine orphan girls in Australia and tracing their background. And actually the Australian resources are really, really good. So if anybody's interested in Australian history, it's really, their archival institutes are really, really good, you know, and they seem to have, you know, documentary evidence that wasn't obviously like ours, that didn't go up in flames. So you get a great idea of their life there. Now, their life before they got to Australia is a little bit harder to piece together, but it is doable. Now, you won't be able to get 90% of it. You might get 75% of it in terms of births, deaths and marriages. You will get baptismal records from various churches. Now, when you're talking the Irish famine period, it's hit and miss. A lot of priests were under pressure burying the victims of the famine, and they really didn't have time to be entering every baptism and death in their books, so they weren't keeping accurate records. So
historically parochial records, and they're well maintained in certain dioceses.
In certain dioceses they were, but I know of a parish down in Waterford where the priest was so overwhelmed, there actually is no entries for a couple of years of the famine. So there's no entries of baptisms, there's no entries of marriages. So they're lost to posterity forever. They're never going to be found. Those years predate the births, deaths and marriages that we know, which largely came in, that official registration, civil registration started around early 60s, kind of 1863, 65. And it took about 10 years until the mid 1870s before they came mainstream.
Okay. So
from that point of view, it can be a little bit hit and miss, but there's always something. What I found is there is always something that can be found and a record that can be found. International records then in other countries are a little more difficult. You may have to travel to find them. You may have to go over to Kew Gardens, you have to go to Dublin for other records. But there's always something to be found. That's one thing I have noticed. And sometimes I find, even when I tell a client, look, I can't really find this now for you, I think we've hit a brick wall. More and more records are being digitized all the time, and even private papers are being donated to archival institutes. And you never know what you're going to find. So I always say to clients, if in the course of my research I come across something that's pertinent or relevant to your case, whether it's a year or two later, I'll ring you up and say, look, I have discovered something in the course of somebody else's research. And when you're doing a lot of the records in this area in West Cork, you do see a lot of similar names coming up if people are asking you to research somebody in the famine period or in the 1880s or the 1890s. You will see names coming up on that sheet and then years later you'll kind of go, I've seen that before. You know, so you'll join the dots for them maybe years later.
You're kind of building on a base as opposed to starting
You're
from
building
scratch.
on a basis of what you know. And then, as I say, with more archives being digitized and more private papers coming into the public domain, you know, that's constantly a work in progress. So research can be difficult. It can be downright frustrating at times. But when you do find that nugget, it is incredibly rewarding when you present it to somebody who's looking for that key point and you're going, well, there it is, or I found somebody.
And when you've been doing it for years, you're building on that base as well. So you're not starting from scratch in some cases.
But you're constantly learning.
Yeah. And other people are availing of that learning that you have now. And you spoke about previously in our conversations about serving as a consultant to those who are writing books, a historical consultant, and they're benefiting from your base of knowledge in terms of how they construct their fictional narrative. Can you walk us through what's that like? Are they interrogating you, or are you providing them with the context to situate their story, or which comes first, chicken or egg?
Well, it is a case of chicken and egg. So basically, usually what happens is somebody will ring me up and go, I have an idea, or I'm halfway through writing a book. Or it could be they're writing a book, we'll say, take two examples. They're writing a book in history and they don't know where to start. They don't know how to get a publisher and they're not quite sure how to write this and where would they find their research. So I will kind of sit down with them or have a Zoom call and kind of decide, right, what do you want to do? Where do you see this going? Do you see it as a bestseller? Do you see it as hardback, paperback, coffee table book, image book? Where do you want this to go, or do you just want to write a story?
This is almost coaching more than consulting.
So it's kind of coaching and mentoring to get them to understand number one, what type of book they want to write. Number two, are they actually familiar with that time frame? So if somebody wants to write be it a Victorian narrative on the history of women in Victorian, the history of fashion in Victorian Britain or Ireland, you know, whatever the topic is, are they actually familiar with the 19th century? Are they familiar with the context in which Queen Victoria came to the throne? Do they even know what time period they're dealing with? Like, I've had people say, I want to study Victorian, they're talking about 1700s. And they're in the completely wrong time period. And they need to be, you know, in the Regency, and they've got their timelines muddled.
Yeah.
So you have to be very clear with them that if they are writing a book, that it's going to be authentic and they know their storyline. And then if you're writing a fictional book, people that want to write a story, for example, a story based about the Irish famine, or they're having a love story in a workhouse, or they're fictionalizing some event of the famine, you know, you have to make sure that they know the context of that workhouse. You know, that, you know, it would be very hard for somebody to fall in love in the workhouse because they're all segregated.
Yeah.
You know, if the wife is over in the women's dormitories and the man is somewhere else, where do they possibly meet? Yeah. And it could only have been at a church service on a Sunday, or maybe, you know, Christmas dinner, they'd have communal dining rights. Sure. So there's different things like that. So you kind of have to know, you know, sometimes I think the easiest way to approach it would be to nitpick at it and kind of go, this isn't historically accurate, that's not historically accurate, but I'll help you. I'll give you reading material that will kind of set the background context for you. I'll fill it in, I'll do some research and give you the links to sites you need to research from.
Would it be better that the author would start with that understanding rather than start writing and then have to be nitpicked at?
Exactly. So I have one manuscript at the moment that I think is okay, because I know the author has a very good grasp of the subject matter. It is fictionalized, but I still need to go through it because it'll be the one thing somebody might pick up on that might have been missed, and it could be something very, very innocuous. Could be a date, could be something simple. I know somebody presented me once saying, I've got this lovely image from the Famine times and I want to use this as my book cover. And I just looked at it and I could see a telephone wire, an electricity wire, and I was like, that's from 1920s, 1930s. It's not the 1820s.
But Ridley Scott had newspapers in Gladiator too, so historical accuracy isn't all it used to be anymore.
Well, historical accuracy and authenticity, or else somebody had a time machine and could see into the future. You know, it's one or the other.
No, I know.
But
being very facetious.
For me, I find historical authenticity, you know, is where I help them, and then to help them write. And I find some authors will write, and because they know their subject matter, they will presume that the person reading it knows the background, and they'll just footnote it. And I have to tell them no, because you might have the source of the footnote, but they don't. So you have to kind of encourage them to expand more.
A little bit more exposition to aid the
context. You know, and kind of frame that storyline a little bit better and give the background, and not be afraid to, you know, it's better to have a huge word count and try and reduce it than to be trying to tell somebody your word count is way too low. Like, this is a chapter, it's not a book.
Yeah, no.
You know, so there's an element of coaching, there's an element of mentoring, and then sometimes they'll just say, look, can you do a certain amount of research for me and help me get this across the line? Can you tell me where I need to go, or I can pay you to go and do the research for me? So it's very much a case of the service I provide are tailored. They're bespoke to each person's or each group's individual needs.
Sure. Okay. Still, it's as you said, it contributes to no 2 days being the same, because you're approaching different authors at different points in their process and providing that bespoke service.
Like I need a very thick diary to keep me focused, because every day is so different that you have to make notes, and every person you deal with, no two clients are the same.
Sure.
You know, I know yesterday I had my book mentoring hat was with somebody in Germany for 2 hours, and then I had to rush out the door and I had to put on my comms and media hat and start thinking press releases and communications, newspapers and press photographers, and that went on for another 3 or 4 hours.
In general, with your career and what OM History Consultant does, is it difficult to change register like that on the flip of a coin, or is that something that you've trained yourself to do as well? Or
I think I've trained myself to do it probably over the years, I suppose, from doing my undergraduate. You know, you could be studying in an archive in the morning. You then could be tutoring in the history department in the afternoon. Then you could be in the library researching that night. Or you could be going to a function where you're suddenly helping and assisting an academic with a major event. So you're constantly switching.
Sure.
And then I suppose career-wise, I had a love of history and I had a love of law and I had a love of teaching. So I've done each of those things.
Sure.
So they've all sort of informed what I do. So I can switch now. You know, some days it's harder to switch than others, and such is life. But it's nice, because if you're getting bogged down in research for one client, at least you know on the flip side you have a meeting later where you know you're going to actually achieve something, or get that press release out, or get the media, or help somebody get on the front cover of the Irish Examiner. You know, that you have that to kind of balance it out. So, you know, you could say, right, I've hit a brick wall, I'm going to leave that, I'm going to do something positive for the other client now that I have a meeting with later. So it can be difficult, but it's doable.
Sure. Okay.
I wouldn't be doing what I do if I didn't.
No, that's clear.
You know, if I wasn't able to do it and do it. But the event ones are good, because when you're having that research brick wall, and then you see something happen, that somebody rings you up and go, oh, you made the newspaper, oh, we're mentioned, you know, or oh, you've managed to get us an interview. That's really good.
Celebrate the small wins and to build momentum back up again.
It builds momentum, you know, and you don't get bored then of what you're doing.
For sure.
You know, with history, people say, people often say to me, oh, your history, is that boring? It's like, not when you do what I do. Some people think of history as, there's this big book and I need to read it, and it's going to be boring and I'm not going to be able for it. So it's kind of, you know, unlock the past, bring it to life, shed some light on it and see it for what it is, and, you know, see what people can do about it. You know, if they look at history, they say, does inform the present, and you need to learn from historical mistakes, maybe.
You'd hope.
So you'd hope. And I suppose people do need to look back, to look forward, and bring what they can with them from the past, even if it's into a museum, and even if it is just to educate people or showcase the Irish diaspora in very many different ways, or to help them write that book that they always wanted to do, but they're not quite sure where to start.
What's your future plans?
Future plans to continue doing what I'm doing and to continue to do it well. I suppose I would like to take a little more clients on in relation to history, heritage, communications and media, and a little bit more of the event management. Also, I'd like to work more with people that have period properties, because being a 19th century historian, I like the period properties and I like those old buildings that can tell a story. So working with a client who wants to have an event, whether it's a Victorian style fashion shoot in an old building, to make sure, the clothes and everything are authentic of the time period, whether it is, even somebody asked me, could I give them advice on their wedding stationery because they wanted a Victorian themed wedding, So there's different areas.
Attention to detail there.
Exactly, but there are people out there who just want that old worldly event. Or if you're doing a really modern event and you're doing a book launch, and you don't know where to start, get in touch. That's what I do.
Sure. So the big event coming up, the event in May, and you've got the Orphan event and the unveiling of the monument. So explain how that all came about and what you hope it will do to shine a light on the plight of these orphans in West Cork, but also in Dunmanway particularly.
So I suppose it came about 2 years ago when a woman visited Dunmanway, and she went to the local historical group and she said to them, look, my great-great-grandmother was a famine orphan and she left here in the middle of the Irish famine, and she was shipped out to Australia as part of the Earl Grey Famine Orphan Assisted Passage Scheme. So this was a scheme whereby it was set up initially by Earl Grey, who was Minister for the Colonies in the UK. I
feel I'm obliged to ask, is he responsible for the tea as well?
Yes. So we have a number of Earls, shall we say. There's Earl 1, Earl 2 and Earl 3, all Earl Greys, as they would be. And the early one before would have been involved in tea. So they would have been in Ceylon and they'd have been out gathering their tea leaves and bringing it back and marketing it as, yes, Earl Grey tea. And then one of those in the 1840s, that Earl, he decided that he liked actually Melbourne, and he had a position in the fledgling administration in Melbourne at the time. And he came back to the UK and he was appointed Minister for the Colonies, and had this notion that there was a huge gender imbalance because of all the convicts that had been shipped out to Australia. And he wanted to address that issue of gender imbalance. So he came up with the idea, what if we have the Earl Grey Assisted Immigration Scheme, whereby we get the famine orphan girls to be shipped out and helped with the population situation in Australia and the colonies. And in 1848 to 1850, that Earl Grey scheme commenced. And many workhouses throughout Ireland decided that they would send famine orphan girls. So to be a famine orphan at the time, either both parents were deceased or perhaps one parent was deceased. But often...
Was the end goal explicitly stated?
The end goal was to offer them a better future. So everything was in the better future, and...
It wasn't framed in population expansion in Australia.
No, population expansion was not the...
Sure.
It was probably the main reason behind it all, but it wasn't the most explicit one that they were told.
Sure.
So they were sent out, and I suppose their journey to Australia was slightly different to the journey of the regular victim of the Irish famine that went to America or elsewhere on what we would call the coffin ships. These ships that went to Australia with these girls were specifically designed with ensuring that nobody died en route to Australia.
What a novel idea.
Because these were their charges that they were paying well to ship out. And this was the future of the colony, depended on them. So before each girl left, they were given a trunk full of new clothes and petticoats and bonnets. And down in Australia, the bonnet has become synonymous with the famine orphan girls who arrived. And I've had to explain to people that those bonnets were not something that they would have worn here. Mm-hmm. They would have, lived their lives 5, 6, 7 years in rags before they ever went down to Australia. So they thought they were getting a new world, new clothes, new wardrobe to arrive. And they also were given nurses and doctors, on board the ship to ensure that they didn't get sick on the way, which was a complete stark contrast to the journey they would have had if they were on the regular coffin ship to America, where it was generally a case of survival of the fittest, and if you were sick and died, you sick and died. And Dunmanway then only availed of this scheme once, and it sent out 13 orphan girls.
What informed it only availing of it once?
It's just once that the Board of Guardians basically could afford to send them out, because they would have to kind of raise money in the area, be it from the poor rates and whatnot. And then there was assisted passage scheme that they got money from the Poor Law Guardians and whatever. It trickled down in time and they were reimbursed. But they just decided once. So places like Skibbereen, Dungarvan Workhouse down in Waterford, other workhouses around Ireland would have availed of the scheme on a number of occasions. Dunmanway availed of it once. And the minute books state for Dunmanway that 15 girls were selected, but it doesn't give the names. So we have to go to the Australian records then to identify who came from Dunmanway. So we have 13 identified. The other 2 were not sure if one may have absconded, because the journey would have been from Dunmanway to Cork, Cork down to Plymouth, and Plymouth to Australia. So one appears to have, gone unnamed along the way. Another one we think absconded. So we have 13 identified. 13 will be remembered in Dunmanway, but we will be mentioning an unnamed other, for those that we may have missed, or that we don't know their names of. And 2 of these, there was 2 Omani girls, and they were both sisters. So where possible, the Poor Law Commissioners and Board of Guardians would often try and send 2 siblings, that there'd be that security for them, which was a good idea. So we would have had 2, I think we had 2 McCarthys, we had 2 Omanis and 2 Desmonds. And the great-great-granddaughter of one of these Desmond girls returned to the local historical society 2 years ago. And she spoke with members there, and they were able to tell her who and where her family came from in Dunmanway. And they brought her to the field where the old family farm would have been. And for her, that kind of pinpointed her sense of identity. Then last year she visited again, and she wanted to go deeper. So they called me in and said, right, how can I help? And she's like, well, I'd really love to put up a monument in memory of the 14, because there's a rock in Williamstown outside Melbourne where they all landed and where the ships would pull in, where these famine orphan girls disembarked, and where they are remembered annually every November, and where the Irish diplomats in Australia go and attend this function. And their names are called out, there's a roll call given. And there's a huge, huge following in terms of the social media platforms and Facebook groups surrounding these girls.
Echoing what you said earlier, celebrated elsewhere, but
celebrated elsewhere, but nothing here.
Yeah.
And obviously, I suppose, with my own research in workhouses, this tied in nicely with what I was familiar with, and giving voices and faces to these victims that were just known as inmates. They were never known as residents of a workhouse, they were always inmates. So they were always identified almost in like penal institutions in penal terms and prison-like conditions. So to give them a voice, I decided this would be really good to get involved. So I told her I would donate my services and I would help to get this monument up and running for her. And as you know, and anybody who does a monument in Ireland will know, monuments do not come cheaply, and they don't come on a small budget. So to facilitate that, we'd come up with some new and novel ideas for the monument. And I suppose your usual monument is large, kind of sculpted monuments. You're talking 20,000, 30,000. Somebody who wants to commemorate a family member doesn't have that type of money. It's as simple as that. And any historical group that's out there, think outside the box. You can commemorate people. It doesn't have to be just a simple sign. History doesn't have to be just that brass plate on a wall. You can go beyond that, and you can get creative with ways. There's no kind of history monument set in stone, we'll say, that you have to replicate.
All puns intended.
No pun intended, but you can set it in another medium.
Sure. So
for her, I kind of tapped into, what would you like? Something from Ireland, something that, I remember her saying, something that embodies this place. And that's what she was doing, this place. And I said, you mean the stones in the walls and the rooms of Dunmanway Workhouse? And she goes, yeah, how do we bring that into something so it's not going to be like a marble slab? So then I had the connection with Mummy Head Studios, and I just rang them and said, right, I have a brief for you. Do you think, you can work with me on this. Can we create a monument, what she wants? Can we replicate the stones? So we have had the stones digitally scanned. So the image and the imprint of these stones will be on an actual monument that will be moulded. And there's a few other intricacies added as well. And we'll have a representation of some of the orphan girls in rags on it. And that's about as much as I'm going to say for now. But the Irish ambassador out in Canberra, he's aware of this happening. The Australian embassy in Dublin are aware of it. And we're hoping for that diplomatic presence to come as well. So we will have that unveiling. And then I decided, you know what? That's a monument. And it's her contribution to her heritage in West Cork, in Dunmanway. But it tells the story. But how do we tell future generations why that monument is there? So I applied for funding then from Cork County Council as a heritage grant to put up a sign that will actually be a timeline documenting their departure, what was the Earl Grey scheme and what happened to them when they arrived, and actually putting one section where all their names are listed. So I worked then with the Friends of Dunmanway Hospital Group to secure funding for that. And that sign, I finished that last week, so that sign and that timeline documenting the voyage, their new land, and we even have 1 or 2 black and white photographs of some of them, you know, in later years with their children and their descendants. We've them there, so we have both the interpretive sign and we'll have a monument then that is put in place there by one of their descendants. So going forward, it's great, you know, and we're lucky that we've had the support of the local hospital and the HSE and the Director of Nursing there to come on board, because they are conscious, you know, that there's a community hospital in Dunmanway that now has about 25, 26, I'm not quite sure how many residents that are there. But when these girls left, that actual compound, according to the minute books, the week they left, had 804 inmates. You know, and when you kind of go, the HSE complex there now had 800 people. You know, it really just beggars belief. And you then start wondering, well, when these people died during the famine, you know, is there bones in surrounding fields? What's there? Where did all of this come from? And a lot of people now are starting to think about it, and I think they realise it's nice to give that sense of, you know that there was 14 or 13 girls from Dunmanway contributed, you know, to populating Australia in very simple terms. And as this descendant said to me, it's estimated down in Australia that 1 in 10 people in Australia, that their heritage can be attributed now to these girls from Ireland. So it's a huge story, and I feel it's nice now to go full circle to have a monument here, knowing that every November they're honoured there. And, you know, as I said at the start of this, a lot of people and their contributions has, you know, been extolled elsewhere, but not at home. And I think maybe, you know, going forward, Irish tourism needs to maybe look again at this whole gathering idea and the diaspora, but not in a way that they're milking it, but think very clearly about how
it's evidence-based.
Yeah,
it's an evidence-based transcontinental echo to an extent. As you said, it's calling to attention what's being done elsewhere.
What's being done elsewhere and how our people are recognised elsewhere, but they're not necessarily recognised at home. Now, I know people will say, watching this will say, there's loads of people recognised at home. But for everyone that's recognised at home, there's probably 10, 20, 30, 40 more that have made a huge significant contribution, and that's just not getting above the parapet at the moment. And I like to take on board those cases.
Solid plan, solid goal for the future. I suppose we ask this of a lot of our podcasts at the conclusion is, with your history of history, but with your history as a history consultant and with your diverse skill set, for someone looking to do something similar or someone to work in this space, what piece of advice would you give them?
It would be something similar to what a client that I had to write a press release for said. Know your craft, do your research, put in hours and hours of experience, whether that would be like me volunteering with groups, volunteering as an undergraduate to assist in conferences, where you get that behind the scenes, I suppose, knowledge, and where you observe.
Yeah.
And when you do an honest, like this client said, when you do an honest 10,000 hours learning, whether that's reading or observing or attending conferences and just taking it all in, that's where you learn.
That's a very specific time allocation the time allocation to a PhD as well.
Exactly. So now you've said it. So, it's probably the same time it would take to do a PhD, and it does take years. So observancy is one, but you must have a love for it, and you must be willing to kind of do the research, put pen to paper. There's lots of sides to it. And then there's the fun days, with social media and putting the videos together and the field trips and bringing it all together. And then there's some downsides to it as well, when you have to do some family trees. Like I've had to search for relatives of children from Besborough, and that side of things can be quite sensitive and difficult. But then you get the good days when you find the long lost family and the families reunite, and suddenly it is happy families.
Sure.
So there's good days to it. There's lots of sides to it that are difficult, but in the main, no 2 days are the same, and you are answering questions for people and you are helping people find answers.
That's good. Thanks very much for your time, Michelle.
And thank you very much.
Take it.